Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time, just your patience, and just being able to share this space with us today. So welcome to our Cultural Talk Story Series. My name is Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaiʻi, Manoa. Today's event is co-sponsored by Blue Ocean Law and will focus on butterflies and birdsong on radical listening with Julian Aguan and Maya Soetoro. Thank you for joining us today to sit down at our table to learn about indigenous communities near and far. Today's event will be live streamed on our community Facebook pages to the 100th Infantry Battalion, Veterans Education Center, aka Club 100, Conflict Resolution Alliance, K2H Honolulu, and the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. So thank you for joining our conversation today about social justice, staying in conversation, and keeping your heart from hardening in hard times. We're going to start today by introducing our special guest. Julian Aguan is an indigenous human rights lawyer and writer from Guam. He's the founder of Blue Ocean Law. It is a progressive firm that works at the intersection of indigenous rights and environmental justice. He serves also on the Council of Progressive International. Maya Soetoro serves as the consultant to the Obama Foundation, working closely with their international team to develop programming in the Asia Pacific region. Prior to her work in the Obama Foundation, she was director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution right here at the University of Hawaiʻi, Manoa. Where in addition to leading outreach and development initiatives, she also taught leadership, social change, history of peace movements, peace education, and conflict management for educators. We are very thankful that she's still within the Matsunaga family and still with us here as faculty. So thank you so much, you both, for being here today. And to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Auntie Maya.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. I'm seeing some folks in chat saying that they are having some issues with volume. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Great. Aloha, everyone. It's beautiful to see where everyone is from. We have Maui, we have Waimanalo, we have Kalihi, we have Saipan, Hawaii Island, Santa Rita, Guam, Mānoa, Eva, and much more. I should open with a brief land acknowledgement, acknowledging Hawaii as an indigenous space whose original people are the Kanaka Maoli, the native Hawaiians. The aina on which we gather here with the Matsunaga Institute is located in the Ahupua'a of Waikiki in the Moku of Kona, on the Mokupuni of Oahu in the Pai'aina of Hawaii. I recognize that Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani yielded the Hawaiian Kingdom and these territories under protest and duress to avoid bloodshed of her people. I further recognize that generations of indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge systems have shaped Hawaii in a sustainable and powerful way that allows me to enjoy her many gifts today. And for this, I am truly grateful. I'm really delighted to have everyone here today and to be able to share with you Julian, who is one of my favorite people. I am grateful to Julian for a number of things. He always manifests a particular kind of leadership and activism that is grounded and begins with a deep love of community, love for people, the gifts that they bring, love for whomever is before him. And that's not to say that he doesn't experience conflict or anger. Anger is useful, of course, because it helps us to understand when things need to be changed or when things require attention. But love really is sort of the prevailing feeling that one gets when in his company. And I hope that you feel that robustly today. And let's begin, Julian, by asking you to please share some words from your beautiful book, a sliver, a story of your choosing.
Thank you so much, Maya and Cesar Masi. I appreciate everyone for coming and being part of this event. So I've chosen to read from one of the more personal essays in the book because the book really has a wide range of pieces in it. But this is a book that's particularly, this is an entry particularly important and personal to me. This one is called, can everyone give me a thumbs up as well, if they can hear me? Okay, cool. This is called Zugu means yoke. The last thing I said to my father when he was still alive was how much I hated him for having cancer. And I hated him hardest the night before he died. It was Halloween. I was a teenage mutant ninja turtle, Donatello, and all I wanted in the world was to get as far away from that hospital as I could. The hospital that smelled like spite and served as a second home to my siblings and me in the months leading up to his death. I threw an epic fit after being told my chances of going trick-or-treating weren't good. I fretted as the hours rolled by, convinced there'd be no candy left by the time I got there. I let every adult in my dad's hospital room, including my dad, know how much I hated being there, hated cancer, hated him. I nagged my poor mother so hard she finally relented and told my oldest brother and his wife, who had just flown in from the States, to take my sister and me to the mall. I knew the candy there wouldn't be half as good as the candy from the houses in Nimitz Hill, but I was dying to get out of there, dying to breathe some other air, dying to have just a little bit of fun. But of course, it was my dad who was dying. Unbeknownst to me, he had been rapidly declining all that day and was, according to the doctors, decidedly on his way out of the world. Of course, I understood none of this then. At 9, one cannot read the signs, cannot see the harried pacing of nurses for what it is, cannot see the emptiness in a soon-to-be widow's eyes. After we buried him, we moved permanently into the house on the hill, the blue and white house on the highest hill in Mount Santa Rosa, the house where everything rusted from the salt water winds that blew in with a vengeance from the Philippine Sea, the house that was never a home. I hated that house. So did my sister. I suspect my brother did too, though he never said so. It's hard to tell because we barely spoke at the time, at least not about anything that mattered. In fact, I mostly avoided him. In fact, we mostly avoided each other. Each of us mourned in our own way. My mom by crying, my sister by self-isolating, my brother by leaving, and me by eating. Believe it or not, though, that wasn't even the problem. The problem, as I see it now, was that each of us mourned alone, as opposed to together. I see it so clearly, each of us an island, all of us at sea. We didn't stand a chance. Luckily, we each found something to get us through those deeply lonely years. My mom found she could disappear into her work. My brother found a girlfriend. My sister found Janet Jackson and a bunch of our dad's old shirts, which she wore religiously because she smelled him in them. And I found a whole wide world on that red dirt mountain. The first thing I found was a family of tree snails, which I'd spend hours watching, wondering why they moved so slowly, wondering if they could, if they had to, move swiftly enough to save their own lives. I found so many things after that. I found I could slide down the smaller slopes at the back of my house if I had just the right piece of cardboard. I found out the hard way that before one runs through an open field of swordgrass, one should wear a long-sleeved shirt. I found no need for a bike. I found butterflies in abundance. I found more grasshoppers than I could count. I studied them closely, that is, when they let me get close. I was awed by how far their little legs could take them. I couldn't for the life of me fathom how such small legs could support such big hops. I wondered endlessly about wings. I was envious of everything that could fly. I prayed without knowing how to for wings of my own. I wasn't the only one. Further down the dirt road, my friend hanged himself in his house, the house closest to the bus stop where we took the bus to school every day, the house where words were shouted, not spoken, the house that was never a home. I learned so many things after that. I learned that same friend was an artist, that he loved to draw, that he drew a picture of a friend just before he died, that he tucked it away in a box beneath his bed, that he was capable of gentleness. I did not exactly know that because my friend was also sometimes my bully. But that's the other thing I learned, that when we are in pain, we inflict pain. That when we feel we can no longer breathe, we grab other people's air. I also learned this. Jigo, the village we lived in, comes from the Chamorro word, zugu. Zugu means yoke, as in to bear a heaviness or to carry a burden. We all bore that heaviness. My sister, most of all. I know this because once when I was 10 and she was 11, I found her outside in the middle of the night wearing nothing but my dad's old shirt, which she had washed one too many times and which, she said, no longer smelled like him. Though it had been only 1 year since he died, I was beginning to be able to read the signs. I could see the emptiness in her eyes. I changed my prayer right then and there. I prayed for her wings, not mine.
Thank you. Thank you for that reading. I've read it more than once, but hearing it from your voice makes me feel all sorts of things. And that's the thing about you and your writing, and and so much of it brings me to tears or near tears. It has such a quality of intimacy. You begin your book by saying that the writers you loved are almost always on a mission to save the world, to redeem us and rescue back our righteous minds. And yet the process of saving the world happens through telling stories like that, that bring that quality of intimacy. I can see and feel everything, all of the textures. I recognize my own childhood in it. And my own losses. And you bring that quality of closeness to public work. And that is what makes you special. And I want to talk about the fact that you do a lot of work addressing the climate crisis. And you write about how the warm-blooded longings for equity and justice figure into the global discourse dominated by the cold language of mitigation and adaptation. And I see this a lot, right? You make a compelling case that the warmth of intimate stories, of art, of creativity are the real way that we begin to heal and rescue. And of course, you're a lawyer, and you know that policy is needed too, and all that hard-edged stuff. But your book convinces us that by turning our lives, our problems, and challenges into art, we infuse all with a new light of understanding and meaning, and thereby make possible the seemingly impossible. So I'd like to ask you to tell us more about what you think that this intimate art and storytelling can really do for social justice, and how it can save us, all of us.
I'm fully prepared for intensely difficult questions, Maya, because yeah, I can already tell we're going to go. These are all going to be really quite thought-provoking. To be honest, I just want to answer, I want to answer every question head on. So the very first thing I thought about when you asked that question was Toni Morrison. You know, she had said that, well, many, insightful things, but one of the things I thought about while I was writing the book, I swear to God, she was breathing in my ear in certain sections. But she said that our lives are already artful. They are just waiting for us to turn them into art. You know, and so when I was writing this book and sort of drawing out the intimacy, I think you have to understand the context in which it was born. You know, I was writing against a backdrop of a global pandemic. A global pandemic that in some ways laid bare all of this sort of historical, unresolved, and structural sort of oppression, like that we face here as the indigenous people of, one of America's longest, running colonies. We live in a militarized colony. The COVID rate was, let me be specific. USS Theodore Roosevelt was just docking. There were thousands of soldiers infected. We had just turned away a private cruise. The governor of Guam did. She had just turned down a private cruise to dock here, but because saying she was worried about the danger of our civilian community. And then just minutes later, it was the U.S. military that came, and then the policy reversed, and she welcomed them all in, and then she opened up all of the hotels, the local hotels. So it was like thousands of sort of U.S. soldiers, hundreds of whom were infected with COVID. They ended up, violating a range of local ordinances, running around and spreading COVID-19 in a way that was really, really intense. And at the same time, just around the same time, we were experiencing a rise in not only unemployment, but suicide. I think at one point around September, when I was writing, it was one suicide in every 6 days. And it was mostly young people. And that was happening, as well as 37,000 people lost their jobs. And so it was just all of that, sort of the enormity of and the scale of that, the suffering and the sort of all of these chickens coming home to roost, so to speak. And I realized I could not write, but I had to there was just too much noise, if that makes sense. And I had to find a way to quiet that down. And the only way I could do is to write in this way. I write in a really close way, because in some ways, the way the local conversation was unfolding, everything felt like a hammer on the head. Everything felt like that. And everything felt very loud. And I was like, the only way that I can communicate this is to try to write quietly, to try to do this and write for the people, for the community, my own people here. And so I started writing about that. And I didn't really plan to do this, but I ended up revisiting all of my first losses. One of the first losses being the loss of my own father, and how my own nuclear family fell spectacularly to pieces at that time. And being such a vulnerable kid on a red dirt mountain, and learning, really watching these tree snails, really wondering if they had to move swiftly enough to save their own lives. I was like, once I wrote that sentence, I realized I had something here. I realized that this is the kind of book, basically encouraging a radical listening to the sort of what Arundhati Roy would call the whisper and scurry of small lives, a radical listening to the lives of those who are more vulnerable than yourself. And I was like, that is how we do it. That's how we rescale. That's how we enter the conversation. We have to do it in a gentler way, and a more loving way, and a more attentive way. And then I started trying to tell this kind of a story in this kind of way, and it emerged, and I believe that art, to get to your question, art, and storytelling, it's so powerful, but it's particularly powerful when it emerges out of communities that have borne, sort of the brunt of this, oppression, who do communities engaged in anti-subordination work. I think of the South African proverb, until lions write books, history will always glorify the hunter. So, I was just imagining what it looks like when lions have pens, and so this is just an attempt. And I do believe that is I'm fully convinced that we need more literature to emerge from our communities, especially, for example, even in Hawaii, we need literature to be emerging out of Micronesian circles. We do. Not because the books are beautiful, but they're mirrors. They're mirrors, really. They're mirrors in which your face does or does not appear. And, Micronesians, we are going through so many things right now. And all kinds of sort of systemic sort of violence that has yet to be resolved, but also the real intimate, the real personal, these experiences. And there's such a wide range. And I'm thinking now of, a young Micronesian boy who was also killed there in Hawaii. And so, yeah, this is what I'm saying. I think that art is absolutely important. And I think we need our artists, especially in times like these, in times where we reach for our language, we reach for words and they are simply not there. We can't access the language that we need to make a crossing. And so I think that's why, art, especially art that emerges from these circles, are so important.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Sorry, Maya.
Yes,
If-
no, it most assuredly does, and I can only hope that we have more, you know, writer lawyers and artist doctors and and voices emerging from the front lines and from farmers and from the houseless and more. I think that there's a way to revise who we think of as storytellers and bearers, carriers of stories, in other words. I want to go back for a moment, though, to a compelling point you made about learning to get quiet and take instruction from our own hearts. And I do think about, and mentioned to you before, how much I love some of these scenes that you etch vividly with very few words. One that comes to mind is Go with the Moon, where you watch a quiet man grow even more quiet as a white net spreads like a circular dream and drops. And, there's this moment where I sort of found myself holding my breath. And there's a great sense of pride of place, wherein we listen very deeply to the gifts of people and community and place that are revealed in that stillness. And it occurs to me that as a teacher for many years, I know that we don't do a very good job of helping kids to listen very deeply in schools. We don't give ourselves the chance to listen deeply to our own interiors or to nature, to the land around us, to one another. And I think that deep listening is really uncomfortable for many people. And so I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit more. You spoke about the importance of it, what listening can do, but how do we overcome the fear that can overtake us in silence, in that space that grows between us when we feel that the difference or divide is great? How do we lean into that discomfort and practice careful double listening and get better at hearing, like truly hearing one another and the land and water around us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's different ways to get at it. I think one of the things that absolutely sort of like emerges to me as like the first response is just there's a tendency to talk at people. We talk about this, a lot of times. So me and you have talked about this before, but there's an importance in trying to find the language to meet people where they are actually at, not where we wish them to be, or we want them to be. And sometimes we just really fail at that. We just can't really, like, I have some footnotes. I mean, actually, in some ways, the footnotes are funny in the book because I kind of use them as this sort of vehicle by which to eliminate every semblance of distance between the writer and the reader, right? Like I let them in sort of entirely into my worldview about certain things, because I'm trying to build that intimacy, and drop all of the walls. But I think that's I in some of the footnotes I talk about that tension, like even here in Guam, and I give concrete examples, but I think that's something we don't really do. I mean, even people and groups that I'm a part of, for example, on the national or global left, so to speak, right? We sometimes just end up not being willing to do some of the work of meeting people where they're at. Like sometimes they're in the middle, and we have to organize them to the left. But we're so, so it takes a lot of work. It's a lot of labor to do that sometimes. And so, but I think that's why art is also very key to this. Like, it's not as if, like, I don't know, I've said this before, but I think I'll just say it here because I think it matters. I think there are like two kinds of information, there's information that merely informs, and then there's information, that moves, that compels, that uplifts, that stirs, and I think that's the kind of information the artists are always communicating. I mean, that's the information that's capable of making shifts, and I think that's like the way we speak to people and the way we speak to each other. I think that's really, really key. And I think for me with the book, was that I, for example, one of the things I was thinking about constantly was Joni Mitchell and her album Blue, which came out in June 1971. I'm kind of a nerd. I know way too many details about that album. But she said when she was writing, the lyrics, the different songs to make up that album, she was saying that she felt like cellophane paper wrapped around a pack of cigarettes. Everything was transparent and there were no defenses. In her life, so there are no defenses in her music. And I was like, this is something it's a way of communicating to people that we've lost, or we just don't practice enough, like having some sort of dropping our defenses. So I was doing that very intentionally in the book and different things. Like, and I struggle with everything from, I have things about Sherman Alexie and meeting him in a bookstore in Spokane, right? To struggling with the patriotism among many people in Guam, despite the fact that the US has stymied our self-determination movement for so many years, in very pernicious ways, so it's like very difficult, tough stuff. And and the readers sort of fall anywhere on the spectrum, but I'm trying to like find different ways to speak to them, and so I think that's definitely part of it. It's like, to do that, you have to listen first. You have to listen to figure out where people are at, and then you try to meet them there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that and how you model that. I know it's not easy, and sometimes people are afraid to take that risk, to approach, even those who want to ally, who want to come near, and who want to love. It's hard. It's even harder if that is not a want in your heart, but it's so important. And I appreciate how well you demonstrate and reveal its potential and its value and strength. You just mentioned the military. You write a lot about the military buildup in Guam and the losses already suffered, and the losses that are likely ahead. You write, if only superpowers were concerned with the stuff of lowercase earth, like forest and fresh water, if only they were curious about the whisper and scurry of small lives. And I read that and felt so sad. But somehow in those essays, or those chapters or vignettes and others, ultimately you always brought me back as a reader to optimism. Perhaps it's because you shared with us in these stories incredible people, like Auntie Frances Ariola Cabrera Meno and the many others who wove their wisdom and stories into your own, or you would speak so beautifully about a woman's strength or the deep love that you felt, or received, or cherished things, love made visible, and the magic of your life. And so I wanted to ask you, since you make us feel optimistic, if you consider yourself to be an optimist, if you feel hopeful. And then the second part of that question is, how do you suggest all those who are listening to you today, but especially any young people who are here, how do you suggest they find and hang on to hope or optimism in the face of deep struggle?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Maya. I can only sort of speak from my own experience. I never really care for the terms like optimist or pessimist. I never really even think of the world, and that in I just never reach for that particular language, but I do think about hope a lot. I do. And I think the thing that's really under-examined, in fact, is that hope is earned. Hope is like cynicism in that way, it's earned. You have to put in the work. I mean, I feel hopeful because I'm actively engaged in sort of like hastening toward the alternative world that I'm trying to build with others, in community with others, with the world that we need and the world of our dreams, you know? That's partly why like some of the organizations I've joined and really been intentional about, like Progressive International, which I'm on the Global Advisory Council for. We just in the last like few weeks, you know, we're taking on issues from global debt to COVID-19 in India to I've got to what's happening with that really infamous case in Turkey, with the recent elections in Latin America. It's just multiple things, right? Our minds are sort of committed. You know, we've taken on these like political projects, you know, because we see fires in the world, but it's because I'm in community with other people that I really do feel like I'm hopeful about things. If I was more an island, right, and I was more you know, more isolated, or, you know, just doing sort of staying in my own lane and worried about my own sort of like tiny circumference of problems, you know, with daily life, I think I would be a lot less hopeful. I do. I mean, but when you're, and that's what I would actually encourage young people to do, to build community with others. I mean, of course, there's the important work of building power in your community and building power across communities, you know, taking on, you know, empire or whatever it is. But it's building community first and foremost, you know, and feeling that sense of togetherness really does give one, I don't know, like a sense of hopefulness. Like there's like what's happening in India under the Modi administration. It's really wild. It's horrific what's happening. You know, and you know, I could sit in my living room across the planet and read about it and just feel really, you know, absolutely overwhelmed, just the way so many of us do, you know. But I think because I'm actively engaged in thinking about and tackling different things with other people, it just feels more bearable, you know? And that's another thing actually I talk about in the book, especially toward the end, you know, we're taking on the military buildup. And like, I'll give you even one more example. So with the military buildup in particular, like I'm not, you know, it's because I'm not sitting down and, you know, feeling, you know, overwhelmed about it. Instead, you know, we went through a decade of litigation in federal courts. Ultimately, SCOTUS denied cert in Davis versus Guam. And then it opened the way to a whole wide range of international mechanisms that are now, you know, available to the indigenous people who want to bring their case. So we're doing like a lot of like sort of work. So we've already filed a submission against the US military to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples last year in the thick of it, you know, and just like the week the book got released, in fact, that like 5 days later, we found out that not only one, but 3 special rapporteurs, and they're independent human rights experts from the Human Rights Council, right, in Geneva, and all 3 offices agreed, you know, like they're so our allegations are substantiated, and they send an allegation letter to the US on the basis of their violation of the right to self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, the right to a safe and clean environment, you know, and the right to culture, health, and life. You know, this is a massive, substantial, concrete achievement. Granted, the US military is still doing what it wishes, you know, in the world. That's what superpowers do, you know, they do what they wish, you know, and so I'm not, that's important though, and it's important context, because I would feel a lot less hopeful if I wasn't sort of just doing that as well, you know, and so that's what I would encourage young people to do. I mean, we should just get out into the world and join other people and link up with others who believe in what you believe. And once you build that community, it really does, you know, you earn hope that way.
Yeah, that's powerful. And it occurs to me that is how we win the freedom from despair. Yeah, you're right. And it is through that action and community. I want to talk a little bit about freedom. You read us a beautiful passage, and you know, you talk about being yoked, and we are yoked to one another, to land and communities, and that's powerful, right? But on the flip side, there is freedom, and you read and wrote about wishing for wings as a child for yourself, and then wishing for wings for your sister, for those you love. And so I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about freedom and what that means for you, and whether you feel that you have found it, and how you think that we can find freedom if we seek it.
Yeah, that I think this is maybe the hardest question to ask, because I feel so conflicted about it, right? I mean, because I'm not interested in this sort of the pursuit of my individual sense of like happiness or feeling a certain way. Like I see the world here in Guam very clearly. I see sort of the centuries of uninterrupted colonization now being sort of like, smashed up against the hyper militarization of our island by a country that's technically our administering power. So we technically, even by definition, are not free. Guam is a colony whose people are, formally slated for an act of freedom, of decolonization, where we choose like one of the 3 internationally recognized options, which includes the option to become our own independent country. So in that sense, it's very clear structurally that we are not. But I think, it's important to remember and really sort of foreground those places that are struggling for that. The place that first comes to mind in the region is West Papua. They definitely have a national liberation movement that is alive and well and kicking, so that is something. So we work with them. But on a personal level, I feel like I don't know how to answer that, but because I've been thinking about that, because this is not the first time I've been asked this, but you've asked it in a way that's making me think harder, for sure. But I think, in some ways, it's like a difference. It's almost like it's the way in the book I tease out the difference between strength and power. Like it's like a constant like motif in the book, for sure. I think it's sort of the same, like freedom, like this idea that none of us are free until we all are. Like, that's really clear in the book too. Like I care about, like I'm actively and most actively working on my own people's freedom, but we also work with the people West Papua, but we also work in Palestine, in Kashmir, and different communities that are feeling this thing. But I feel free this is sort of related to the last answer. I feel most free, I feel most alive and most free when I'm sort of moving in that direction with other people, when I'm like really in solidarity with these different communities doing that. But on a personal level, I want to make this clear too. We are so much more than our suffering. We are so much more than the present historical circumstance. So that's another thing too. I wanted to write beyond the colonial gaze, just like writing beyond the white gaze. They're not the center of the story. So when I write, and I'm also uplifting just the daily lived experiences of Chamorros here at bus stops, in the village, in the jungle. And all of those, centering all of those experiences, because I feel like this book, because it is that mirror in which young indigenous Chamorro faces appear when they read that, I feel this book can help them feel more free, because they can access this, it's someone centering their experiences too. I've received so many emails and messages from complete strangers, including diaspora Chamorros whose families have left for one reason or another, including a family who left in the 90s because of drug use. And then the whole family is reading the book now at 3 generations, and it's really mind-blowing, that the book it's doing something. It's doing something that's, moving people's hearts in a way that's allowing them to face something. I think that's really what maybe freedom, the best I can get at freedom is movement toward freedom. That's the best I can achieve, right now. And I think that feels really good, and just reminding people, about pointing them in the direction of beauty makes me feel more free.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that it's really also about the process, right? We have, as we sort of liberate ourselves, we are sort of interrogating those relationships, and we are finding ways to clear pathways, and we are stretching and reaching for things we didn't know we needed, and and so it's perpetual motion, I guess, is what you're saying. And we have to balance that freedom with deep connection, right? And not be too individualistic in our thinking. So thank you for that. I want to make room for questions, so I'm going to ask only one more question.
Okay.
Meaning I want to make room for questions that others ask. I've been greedy in asking you so many, but it is clear that you are a lover of language. And I feel like we share that. To me too, finding language feels like healing. You say or write that it's like stepping beyond our trauma and stepping into the sun. And that resonates with me too, where we can grow. So I want to end this portion of our time together by asking you to speak more about your process of finding language, and also about any recommendations you have for us about finding language, especially to talk about those tough things like sorrow, anger, grief, wants, and how do we find the language to lift up our vision, or to make a movement. So it's kind of like the balance to the question of deep listening, finding language. And I guess I imagine a lot of people are curious about how you find and found the language.
Yeah, actually, the very first thing I think about is fighting words. That's the entry I think that you took a line from. But that entry, I'm talking about an instance of abuse, elderly abuse of my grandmother. And I found her being abused by a relative. And she was, I'll just briefly, tied to a bed. And I saw a brown rope and a silver bowl on the floor. And I just blacked out. And then the next thing I know is my 8-year-old body is hanging upside down by its ankles. And my cousins are passing me back and forth. And I write in that piece that I was keenly aware, of just that there was little I could do because I was little and I had too little power. And I did not have the language I needed to set me or her free. That is like, and I realized though, and I didn't write this in the book, but that's precisely the moment a writer is born. A writer is born first in the absence of language. When we as a human being are confronted by an existential sort of, like by an experience, that is haunting and oftentimes traumatic. And like the insistence on finding that language to graft your will upon the world when you know that you need it. It's not a luxury. Language is not a luxury. It's a necessity, on this journey toward freedom. And when you know it, so that from that very moment, I was like, I will spend my life, finding that language. And, that's what in some ways the book is trying to, help other young people see that. Young people who are struggling to get over some very difficult terrain, it's trying to help them make that crossing, walk over that bridge. But I mean, that is a really like an important point, but I think that is key, and I think that's the sort of the essay that I sort of really get to the heart of that. But also, I also talk about different things in that essay as well, all the gifts that my grandmother gave me, including my love of music, mostly the blues. I say in the book, in that entry, she bequeathed to me so many gifts, though of the spiritual, not earthly kind, including her almost religious belief that that if God had a voice, it would be Aretha Franklin's. So like I trying to like use all of it, like the moment has, it has all of it though, like honoring someone, memory, and she's more than just that moment, and so all of that. So I think that's a really sort of the only real personal way to try to answer that question, and I think the book in some ways is the answer to the question. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Sios Maase, Julian, thank you so much. Mahalo. We are so grateful for this conversation, for this time, for your deep sharing. And I think that I'm going to hand it back now to Jose. Is that right? Jose has been culling questions, I believe.
Yes, we have a couple questions from the audience, and the audience, please feel free to submit any last minute questions you may have. Well, one of the ones that came up a little earlier, actually the individual's not with us anymore, but is it remotely possible to listen radically and openly to strident Trumpsters?
I can't even, sorry, what was the question?
Is it remotely possible to listen radically and openly to strident Trumpsters?
I think the idea is here, is it possible to be radically open to those who are of a political and social belief system that is really distant from your own,
Yeah.
and
No,
and offensive to you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Of course, the first thing I think about is the famous, very useful quote by James Baldwin, about a difference of opinion. If it's rooted in your adamant objection to my survival, then obviously it's not just a difference of opinion, he had a really great quote for that. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was really useful because it really sort of cast a light on the fact that sort of some of these are fake arguments, they're not really they're not about the finer points of a policy. That's how oftentimes what I found is conversations that they pretend to be about something else. It's like, but that's not real. There is sometimes opinions that are just rooted in very hateful thinking, and I no longer waste my time with that. Sorry to be blunt. I no longer I'm not so easily baited anymore. I used to be, it's taken a lot of work. Because I think some conversations, I think you have to use your intuition. I think you intuitively know when someone, including someone who has supported Trump. I've argued with relatives who have supported Trump, and that's one thing, but supporting Trump and underneath that, really looking at lots of sort of feelings underneath that sort of political choice. And I've had conversations, lots of them about that. And I have really listened to some of those people, but others, it's not really about that. I think two parties in a conversation, party A and B, have to have a genuine interest in pursuing some truth together. If that is not, it's a shared enterprise. And if one party is doing it, that's just me doing work or me, wasting my time. And I no longer do. Sometimes I just give people a reading list. I was like people who say real rudimentary things like that, are rooted in just sort of a spectacular lack of understanding or having read anything on a subject matter. For example, I won't take my time to explain it from the beginning because there's just a zillion sources for it, and so I'll give them a reading list instead. I was like, if you wanted to read this, then we should talk after. That sounds slightly rude. It may be, but it's sort of like how I handle sort of the most sort of extreme examples of that kind of conversation.
Thank you so much. Actually, as you were saying that, so the next portion, you don't actually have to answer it because you kind of already did. The question was just about how do you or we choose whom to listen to and whom to protect ourselves from? And somebody else in the audience quoted James Baldwin, as you had mentioned. And the quote goes, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." So I love how the audience is just kind of taking care. They're very actively.
I think that's important, Jose. I'm really glad that the audience is responding that way, only because we have to be healthy and functional. We have to also guard ourselves, and I think part of that work is not being so easily baited, by real rudimentary sort of thing. And also, yeah, I think that's just an important point.
May I interject? I think someone has inadvertently direct messaged me a question that was meant for you, for all to see. It says, Manashim, from an Indigenous law student, how do we lead from an authentically Indigenous perspective within the legal and political framework, especially as it relates to climate change? Of course, we need to write and make art, but what about substantive and procedural approaches? What advice would you give young lawyers who want to tackle the climate change crisis?
Oh, that's so great. There's so many different things, initiatives, that that exact group of people can support. For example, I would immediately join a group if I were a young person that was involved in the criminal defense or civil defense of, sorry, hold on. I just need to swallow, hold on. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I would get involved with people, for example, Indigenous activists on the front line, opposing one or more kinds of extractive industries, which is directly a climate justice sort of project that they're doing on the ground. And I would be involved in the legal organizations that are providing them pro bono services as they, block these pipelines, put their sort of dreams on the line. Sometimes, even as lawyers, it's not. We are just our best, the role that we can play in any given moment is to provide legal support for those who are actually committing direct action, for whom there are risks. That's one thing. The second thing is you can just have a big picture and understand that, for example, I teach international human rights law. The first thing I think about is the Alien Tort Statute. It's a federal statute that authorizes, lost causes of lawsuits in U.S. district courts for violations of the law of nations, And so that was like a more than 100-year-old statute when it was first used by people like Peter Wise in Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, brilliant team of lawyers. And they're like, let's dust off this old, statute and see if we can put it to some use. And so that's how we have everything from Filartiga versus Peña Aralia to the WIWA cases, the Doe versus Unical. All of these are basically human rights cases where, for example, corporations involved in or aiding and abetting certain states, as they were sort of laying down, expanding the oil and gas, so these are all human rights cases, right? But they were started because people, really were doing what you were saying to do, which is be more creative with the law or figure out what legal handles there are that are sort of underused, because at that time it wasn't used. And so it was dusted off and used in the first time and successful in the early 80s and then ever since. But more to your question about Indigenous specifically, we do that as delusional law. We try to take our cue from the Indigenous communities most affected by any given extractive industry project. For example, the Indigenous communities in several villages living along the North Ireland coast of Papua New Guinea, they have been long protesting Papua New Guinea's own involvement with regard to an extractive industry known as deep sea mining, and the International Seabed Authority based in Jamaica, and empowered under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They had all the lawyers that were helped out with the ISA and who still sort of run that, including some, anyway, I don't want to get too detailed, but in that scenario, lawyers without an international environmental background, right, or international Indigenous rights background, they didn't really see potential arguments for the application of free, prior, and informed consent. And we did, because a lot of what's happening in these waters, it's not about where the activities are happening, but where their impacts are felt. And so actually free, prior, informed consent does apply to a certain, a good number of deep sea mining projects. They do impact Indigenous peoples in their ancestral spaces. And so we've been trying to tool civil society organizations on the ground, most of whom are Indigenous-led groups, protesting this particular extractive industry, which has everything to do with climate change. And not enough people know that connection. But basically, deep sea mining, if it's allowed to proceed to the actual commercial mining phase, it would be a doomsday climatic event. It would, because the deep sea organisms living around these hydrothermal vents, they actually eat. They sequester carbon and methane, more specifically, which is a way harsher greenhouse gas, which is terrible for the climate. And we don't know, but all the studies that emerged from all these oceanic institutes from 2012 onward clearly show, that this would be a doomsday climatic event. And so we have been supporting Indigenous peoples using arguments that were never used before, arguing for the application of free, prior, informed consent with regard to their contestation of development projects. And in some ways, in some cases, we've been successful. Like even Nautilus Minerals, a Canadian company, like their value tanked. Like we helped support the community build this really robust sort of infrastructure across Pacific Island communities, where several indigenous groups across 14 different countries had all had something to say about this extractive industry. And we've helped them by arming them with the vocabulary of the law in that instance. Does that answer your question? I mean, there's just so many ways, you know, that we as in young indigenous lawyers can take up space. And it's partly having a spacious, capacious mind, you know, and is your willingness to sort of try new things and to be innovative. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Julian. We have one last question from our audience. It's a question about writing, and how do you switch from creative writing into from creative writing to legal academic writing, balancing your personal and professional? And this person happens to be a student, and they themselves find it difficult to shift their brain from these seemingly opposite forms of expression.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand the impulse. But before I answer your question, I want to direct you. There's so many like brilliant legal scholars who have found a nice marriage. They have found a way to keep their sort of authentic writer's voice fully intact, even when they're delivering the sharpest critiques of existing analytical frameworks. Like one Hawaii-based one that comes to mind is Mari Matsuda. You know, like her pieces, they're incredible. Some of them are incredibly heartfelt. Like Looking to the Bottom, which is about elevating the perspectives of those who are experiencing subordination, you know, like elevating why it's critical to the, you know, to law, to legal theory, you know, and the development of, yeah. So that's a great piece, but so many others like Mai Van Lam. I mean, there's so many other people who are already working in that field who've managed to find a way to have their sort of beautiful, much more holistic, robust, full-bodied type of literary voice merged with their legal one. So that it does exist. It's not super common, but it does exist. And the other answer is, I think in some ways for me, I kind of view it as different. Like when I'm writing like a brief, I'll just break it into three. If when I'm writing a brief, it's like you are reaching for like the cold precision of an assassin's bullet. You are firing a gun, you know, in a way, like it's so narrow and so focused. But when you're writing like a vignette about fishing with your godfather, or the importance of a native flower, you know, and writing about this, I think you're building a fire. And I think your project is different. Your enterprise is different. Your project then turns into building a fire in order to warm as many warm-blooded people as possible, you know, as many other human beings as you can. And so the quality of the writing changes, but it doesn't feel laborious or strenuous to switch back and forth when you remember what the project is. When I wrote this book, The Properties of Perpetual Light, you know, the project became very clear, you know. I'm writing in a way that is trying to eliminate the distance between myself and my reader. And I'm writing in a way that's acknowledging sort of the pain and the trauma of everything that we as people have been through, but in a way that's gentle enough, you know, where it's not like a hammer, you know, like, and it's almost a little bit, and it's not prescriptive or preachy, the different pieces. I'm not trying to like prescribe the cure for their harm. Rather, I'm enlarging a question, you know, I'm trying to interrogate the edges, you know, I'm trying to worry the parameters of the possible. I'm trying to help them take up more space. And because that's the project, it becomes very easy to switch. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. And just in the spirit of everyone's time and your time, I just want to, I'm going to do closings. For anybody in the audience, if there's questions we didn't get to, I promise I'm going to email them to Julian, and when he has time, he will get back to me, and then I'll share it out again. I think that might be the best way to kind of close it out for now. But I do want to thank you, Julian, for providing us just this wonderful opportunity just to learn about your community. It's truly just been an honor to share space with you today. Thank you for just such a beautifully thought-provoking event and so many like wonderful kernels of knowledge. Thank you. I'm actually looking forward to rewatching this just to take in everything you and as well as Maya have shared. And one thing that really resonated with me, just you're correct. I mean, a writer is born in the absence of language, and how powerful it is to have that skill. Myself being bilingual speaker, there's just so many things that I'm still trying to develop and find the right words, because I wasn't able to fully develop them one way or the other. So I feel like I'm constantly competing with myself in different languages. So thank you. I truly love the reminder of a collaboration, community, connection between each other, but also being inclusive of our ancestors, which is so important as we move forward. Thank you for allowing us just to be a guest at your home today. And Maya, thank you just for everything, just your guidance during today's conversation, for just continuing to uplift voices in everything you do. And last but not least, I want to thank everybody who's joined today's event. We deeply appreciate your interest and support in sitting down at our table to learn about Indigenous communities near and far through our Cultural Talk Story series. Thank you, everybody.